Good afternoon, everyone. If you can hear me, just click the raise your hand button. Thank you. Uh, okay, so let's get started. Welcome back to our monthly webinars. Last month, we took a little bit of a break because I was talking at the BFRB, the TLC BFRB conference. So that was sort of at the same time as our webinars. So we're back this month. Let me just, before I get started, let me activate the poll so that you can vote for for the topic next month. I didn't edit the name of the poll, so it says April, but what I actually meant was June. So it's active and I will deactivate it once I finish the webinar. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Vladimir Miletic. I am SkinPick's clinical lead and, well, the person that talks at these webinars every month. Our topic for this evening is guilt and skin picking. If my laptop would kindly switch slides, here it is. So this is some of the stuff that we will be talking about. So first, obviously, as always, we will define what is it that we're talking about. So we'll talk a little bit about what is guilt. We will talk about guilt as a cause of skin picking. We will talk about guilt as a consequence of skin picking. And then we will talk about a way in which guilt actually helps maintain skin picking. So regardless of how you see guilt and what role you find for it, it's definitely something that you have to, or most people anyway, have to work with as a part of their sort of journey towards healing, let's say. And then in the end, I will talk about what is it that we can do with guilt practically. So what is it that we can learn from guilt and how can this help us change? And after this, as always, we will go to the Q&A part. I see that some of you have already asked some questions. Feel free to ask as many as you like. Once I finish my talking part, I will get to all or most of them. Questions don't have to be related to the webinar content. Of course, you can ask anything you want to know. Well, as long as it relates to psychology. So let's start by defining what is it that I'm talking about when I'm talking about guilt. If this is not your first webinar, then I really don't need to introduce the man on the right. And if it is your first webinar, it's George Kelly, an American psychologist whom I often quote and probably like a little more than it's healthy to like someone. So I will talk about his constructivist approach to guilt because I happen to think it's the most practical approach to guilt that I know of. But before I explain this mouthful of a definition, I want to tell you just a little bit about how constructivists see emotions in general, because I think it might help you put this webinar in context. So for constructivism, human emotions are merely information about what's happening to us. In a way, you can look at emotions from the constructivist point of view as being a type of internal weather forecast. The same way that you can type in, where you live and you can get the weather forecast for tomorrow. You will see if it's cloudy or sunny or raining or snowing or depending on where you live. Emotions do the same thing only internally. I have to add this bit in because very often when people talk about emotions, they tend to think of them as being very serious, solid, objective, and permanent judgments on who you are as a person. So when people feel guilty about something, their conclusion is very often, well, I'm a horrible person for feeling this. From the constructivist point of view, this could not possibly be more wrong. Guilt and any other emotion, good or bad, is a signal that it's just a type of awareness that we have that talks about how we assess our current behavior or the situation that we're in. So it's information, it's not judgment. When we talk about guilt specifically, we talk about guilt as being awareness of your own dislodgement from your core role structure. I know that sounds, strange, but allow me to elaborate. So to put this in the most simplistic terms possible, guilt means that you are aware that you did something that goes against your own principles. So it's an information about how you assess your behavior. It doesn't say that you're a horrible person. It says that you did something that you think is wrong. And these are very different things. So let me go into a few more details here. So I already said that Kelly is a constructivist. If Kelly is a constructivist, that means that we talk about constructs all the time, right? So one way to think about constructs is that there are these little boxes in which we put different experiences, ourselves, people around us. So we have good boxes, bad boxes, there are all kinds of boxes, and they usually arise from your lived experience. They arise from your culture, your family, from all sorts of things. So basically, it's how you classify everything that happens to you. And because we have quite a number of these boxes, they can't all be equally important. So if you look at the pyramid on the right here, that's pretty much how Kelly envisioned our constructs to be arranged. He said they're hierarchical. So you have those constructs that are at the base of the pyramid, and they're not really that important. They're very kind of concrete, specific, particular. They don't really make up who you are as a person. So when you find yourself having to change boxes at the bottom of the pyramid, that usually doesn't cause you to feel guilt because it's not that important. You can recognize it as an error, but you don't feel like it reflects fundamentally who you are as a person. But then as you climb up the pyramid, these boxes become more and more important. And then when you come to the very top of the pyramid, you only have a few boxes. And these boxes are obviously the most important ones because these boxes hold the whole pyramid together. So what in constructivism, we call these core constructs. And this is why Kelly says that guilt is essentially a dislodgement from these core constructs, because it's the most important principles that you have. It's who you think you are. This is what we dislodge ourselves from, or find ourselves being dislodged from, when we feel guilt. Right. So it's the very top of the pyramid. Uh, that this also means, so what I'm explaining here is basically the mechanics of how guilt operates. Constructivism doesn't really go into content because everyone's experience is different. People come from different cultures. They're raised by different families from different states, countries, continents. So the content of our boxes can be very different. In fact, we often take it for granted that when we say the same word, we actually mean the same thing. This is why psychologists tend to be very boring and ask a lot of questions, because we try to make as few assumptions as possible about what your boxes are like. We like it when people explain their boxes to us. In fact, very often people will say things like, well, of course I want to be a good person. And then I will ask, well, what does it mean to be a good person? And then they will roll their eyes at me like I'm asking the most obvious thing. But it is not the most obvious thing. And in fact, when I listen to my clients, I think in most cases, what they mean by being a good person is not the same thing as what I mean when someone is a good person. And indeed, I think if my clients could possibly hear their stories together, they would also have the same idea, that other people have very vastly different ideas. I will give you one example, but without sort of making any judgments, just as an illustration. And that's politics. I think politics is excellent to illustrate this. If you look, let's say you look at most of us here probably are, acquainted with American politics to one degree or another. Uh, Basically, in a two-party system that's so polarized as American politics currently is, you have both parties that are saying that they want to work in the best interests, of their country. They both want to make their country as best as possible. But then when you look at the content of what it means to improve a country, you will see vastly different policies. So on the surface of things, they could all attach the same label. They will all say, we want to make our country better. But then when you actually start looking around in their boxes, you see that they're so different that they share very little, which is one of the reasons, obviously, why politics is so polarized. And this goes for every person. We can feel things that I might feel guilt for, you might not, and vice versa. That also means that guilt, as related to skin picking, can mean different things to different people. The act of picking one's skin may be similar or same, but fundamentally what it means for each of us and why it might make someone feel guilty and someone else not is extremely individual and very different. Let me give you a recent example which speaks very badly of me, but I will give you the example anyway. um, I've always, since I started working as a therapist, I always had one nightmare, which is to forget about a scheduled session. And I was always very careful about this. I remember once, like a decade ago almost, when we were still working in person before COVID and all these measures. uh, I was having a session with a client and someone knocked on the door. And I immediately thought, oh my God, could it be that I double booked or something? And I went to the door, I looked through the people, and sure enough, there was a client of mine. And I thought, how is this possible? This is my worst nightmare came to life. I'm a horrible therapist. I'm a horrible person. What have I done? And only to realize that it's my client who actually came an hour earlier because he didn't understand, just made a mistake. But I was immediately terrified. So that wasn't guilt just yet, but it was threat. It's kind of like a step before guilt. And then relatively recently, it happened to me that I actually did it. And I didn't double book a client, but a client of mine tried to change the session that we had scheduled, and the new time slot for the session, for whatever reason, I didn't write it down. Usually I write everything in my calendar. I set reminders so that I don't forget about such things. I see that you're raising your hands. So please just type the questions and I will get to them at the end of the webinar in about 20 minutes, half an hour. So anyway, I just checked my email randomly because I thought I had some free time. And I saw an email from my client saying, well, I waited for you for 20 minutes, but you didn't show up. Would you mind telling me, what's your next available time so that we can have a session? And I hope you're okay. And immediately I thought, I just might as well change professions right now because I'm done. This is like the cardinal sin for me. And then I replied to the client, I apologized. I confessed my sin, which is that I really did not write things down. And so the next session with this client came along and I immediately apologized again because I was still feeling bad. And the client said, it's okay, don't worry. But that wasn't enough for me because I felt guilty. And then I apologized again. And then again in another way. And then at one point, my client said, like a few minutes into the session, and he smiled and said, no, really, it's okay. I know that you're human. It's fine. And then I thought, oh my God, this person doesn't really think this is a big deal. And then when I thought it over, I realized that yes, for my client, this meant minimal disturbance because it was an online session. So he just continued to do whatever it is that he was doing before. In my mind, this was as disastrous as anything that could possibly happen. In the mind of my client, it was basically an afterthought. So I had produced myself into the worst therapist in the world because for me, this is a major dislodgement from my core role, from how I see myself as a therapist. Whereas for my client, that just meant we'll reschedule. For me, this is a very drastic example, but I'm sure you can find many examples like this. So when we talk about feeling guilty because of skin picking, it's very important to think in terms of what am I feeling guilty for? Like what's the box that I had to take myself out of? That's so important. So let's break it down into those three categories that I mentioned. First, guilt as something that can cause skin picking. If you remember, if you attended any of our older webinars, we had a webinar on experiential avoidance, or rather, in this particular case, a webinar on avoiding emotions. And skin picking indeed can be seen as a form of experiential avoidance. What this means is that skin picking is essentially a strategy that people will employ so that they don't have to process their emotions and still get some release and some kind of soothing. Right. So guilt is very unpleasant. It's one of the worst things that we can feel. And to top things off, guilt rarely, if ever, comes alone. So guilt is usually followed by threat and anxiety, and they're like the best of friends. They usually really just show up together at the same time and make your life miserable for a while. Because it's so overwhelming and intense, we kind of tend to want to distance ourselves from that. And then by avoiding guilt, we kind of reach towards skin picking because it is a way to release all that excitation that guilt creates without actually having to process what this experience means and what's the implication of it and what are the consequences of it. Right. And then as you use skin picking to avoid actually processing uh, guilt, you kind of lead to more guilt, which is what I will explain in a minute. Because avoidance patterns function in such a way that they actually reinforce themselves. When you avoid an emotion, for example, an important emotion such as guilt, um, you don't really understand what it means. And the less you look at it and the more you avoid it, the scarier it becomes. Because it looks so vague and menacing and awful, you tend to avoid it more. Then you look back, it looks even scarier, so you avoid more. You look back, it looks scarier, you avoid more. So avoidance leads to more avoidance, essentially. Right? And then guilt becomes even worse because it's less precise and then it seems bigger and more insurmountable. I hope that makes sense to you. I will give you an example of how it works a little later on. At the same time, guilt can be a consequence of skin picking. So picking usually for most people at least, creates a paradoxical reaction. So initially, it brings a sense of calm and relief and soothing and gratification, but then it's immediately followed by quite intense guilt or shame, or all of this combined. Sometimes clients actually describe to me feeling both soothing and gratification and guilt at the same time. It's like a parallel experience almost for some people. So think how picking relates to your values and who you are as a person. So once you feel guilt, that means that you are breaking a very cardinal rule. I will give you a few examples of it doesn't mean that this is true for you. Those are just some examples that I tend to see in my clinical practice, and it might get you to think and reflect and find your own answers. One thing, why people feel guilty as a consequence of picking usually relates to health, which is that once you're done picking, you see the damage that you've caused. You see the potential for infection. You're afraid of scars. You see yourself as a person that doesn't take care of their own health. And if this is important to you enough that it's, in one of those core constructs, this is where you will feel guilt. Self-harm is another very common way that people understand skin picking. Skin picking, to be perfectly honest, psychologically speaking, rarely is self-harm. However, people do perceive it that way, and they will say something like, why the hell am I doing this to myself? Why am I harming my body? So that can be a source of guilt. And then once that is a source of guilt, the next question is, okay, what am I supposed to do really? So what is it that I expect of myself? And then you can find, your basket, your construct. Sometimes it's control. People will pick and pick and pick and pick, and then they will feel guilt, not necessarily just because they've picked, but also because they have no control over it. And they expect to have control over their own behavior. So having something so overwhelming or strong makes them feel guilty, because control is good, lack of control is not good. So once you cross over to the no control part, you've dislodged yourself from how you see yourself, right? Weakness is also another very common theme, that people will somehow interpret skin picking as being a sign of weakness, and then they will feel guilty because they're supposed to be strong. So once you pick, you might feel guilty because you see yourself as weak. Sometimes people will see this as punishment. And I find this especially in people who like to emphasize self-care and personal development. When they construe certain behaviors as being a form of self-punishment, they will feel guilty because they're doing the opposite of what they expect themselves to be doing, right? Conflict is also a big one. Very often, especially in relationships, when you have a conflict with your significant other, people will sometimes see themselves as being, I don't know, like a bad partner, and that can cause them to feel guilt. Failure, another big one. Even soothing is something that can cause people to feel guilty, as unusual as that might sound to most people. So each one of these point to the box and to the rule essentially that you've broken by picking. So picking can cause it and it can be a consequence of it. And so when you put these two together, you get a very convenient, or rather, shall I say, inconvenient pattern, how picking actually sustains itself, you know, using guilt. So let me give you an example. So we have a cycle described here. Let's say, let me see some of the examples from the previous page. Let's say conflict. Let's say you had a fight with your partner for whatever reason. So you, after the fight, let's say that you were very vicious and you said all kinds of bad things, like the worst that we say when we're upset. And then at the end of the argument, you see that you hurt your partner. So you see your partner suffering and you think, what kind of a person am I to cause my loved one to suffer? And then you feel guilt, you feel threat, you feel anxiety, you might feel fear for your partner, for your relationship, and so on. So all these emotions accumulate and they're quite intense. Skin picking jumps right in as an avoidance mechanism. So let's say you run to the bathroom and you pick for a while and you really just kind of sink into picking, into one of those trance-like states where picking is all there is. And while you're picking, you're not processing the fight. You're not thinking about its implications. You're not thinking about your partner. You are picking and you're soothing yourself. And then at the end of the picking session, you feel calm and you feel relaxed, and all this horrible tension that happens in your body just kind of disappears. You look into the mirror and you think, what have I done? And then when you think, what have I done? There's guilt again, and there's anxiety again, and there's threat again. The whole gang gets together again, and then it initiates another cycle of picking. Now, the way that guilt operates here is quite ingenious because it's not the same type of guilt, as you can see. So the first type of guilt was over, I've hurt my partner, for example. This can be one box in which you put yourself in. And then the second time around, once you complete the cycle, guilt is about something else. It's about what have I done to myself? Right. So guilt kind of switches the game one level up, and then you complete the cycle again, and then one level up and you complete the cycle again. So guilt is a major link in how picking perpetuates itself. I often talk to people about acceptance and forgiveness and compassion, and they always think I try to sound like Oprah on purpose, and I really don't. But the thing is that compassion and forgiveness are direct ways to break this cycle. Compassion literally tells you if you're suffering, just be nice to yourself, don't make things worse. And for example, even if you went through the first cycle of picking, compassion would be enough to sever the cycle after only one turn. You wouldn't have the what have I done, what kind of a person am I cycle. Instead, you would see what you've done and then you would do everything you can to make yourself feel better, right? In general, I think compassion is an excellent antidote to guilt, because it's forward looking. It says, how can we reduce suffering now? So forgiveness and compassion are two excellent ways in which you can break this cycle. And now my favorite part, which is to see what is it that we can do with guilt other than just cultivate compassion and forgiveness. Both of these work and they're very powerful tools, but I don't think they give, at least in my imagination, in and of themselves, they don't give you enough intellectual insight so that you can intentionally direct your change. They're excellent and they're great, and I highly advise practicing them, but I don't think they tell the whole story. I mentioned before that in constructivist psychology, we think of emotions as being a kind of internal, just weather forecast. Right. So the constructivist term for this would be transitive states or transitional states. That means that emotions, good ones, bad ones, carry information about what's happening inside, outside, or in the way that we're interacting with the world. Even happiness is information. It's just not bad information. Working with emotions in a healthy way means that we're able to understand the information that they carry. So you can translate the message, let's say, and you can use it to proactively kind of change something so that you don't repeat the same mistake. There's a very there's a very nice quote by Richard Rorty who explains pragmatist ethics. I don't remember where is it from. I think perhaps from Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, where he says that sometimes in life we do things that we think we would rather die than do. And then he says that what we can do is either just kill ourselves right away because we've done the unthinkable, or spend the rest of our lives in misery and feeling guilty for what we've done. Or he says we can take the pragmatist route and just live by trying not to do that again. And I think this is fully aligned with the way that constructivism approaches emotions. So we have to understand them and decipher them precisely so that we would not make the same mistake to which they're pointing out, right? So we have to do two things. We have to understand them, and we have to be able to experience them fully. Because in order to actually understand them, you have to experience them. If you just glance at guilt and then immediately run away, you don't fully understand it. If you remember what I was talking about avoidance cycles, the more you run away, the less you actually know, and then the scarier it becomes. So we have to learn how to sit with our emotions, and then we have to learn how to translate them. So this is a very nice quote by Pema Chodron. She's a meditation teacher, but she's a Buddhist. So there's a mention of the word karma somewhere in there. Just check it out if you don't like it. But this is, I think, a very nice way to succinctly say what I'm trying to say. So here goes. People get into a heavy-duty sin and guilt trip, feeling that if things are going wrong, that means that they did something bad and they're being punished. That's not the idea at all. So the punishment is not the point. The idea of karma is that you continually get the teachings that you need to open your heart. To the degree that you didn't understand in the past how to stop protecting your soft spot, how to stop armoring your heart, you're given this gift of teachings in the form of your life to give you everything you need to open further. So she is essentially pointing to the same thing that Kelly is, which is that there where you have guilt, there is what she would call a soft spot. So there is something there. Instead of hiding it away, it's much better and healthier to open yourself up to that. Or she would say that it's I really like the way that she says that you get a teaching in the form of your life, right? She also has a whole book basically that talks about opening up to suffering, or as she says, let everything be your teacher. And I really like that approach. And admittedly, it sounds a little touchy-feely. And we come to this topic from time to time in our webinars, and I always leave unsatisfied in terms of how I conveyed the message, because essentially what I'm trying to say isn't easily verbalizable. It's not something you can just explain in one sentence, because the idea is that you should be able to experience your emotions fully, or as she would say, kind of open up to the suffering, but not be overwhelmed or swayed by it. It's something that we learn from, let's say, cultivating mindfulness. It's something that religion can bring to a lot of people, because it does give you a kind of calm inside when you know that you've done well, or you've done as best as you can, when you know that your suffering has a greater purpose. One thing that if any of you are practicing meditation or have practiced it for a longer period of time, one of the insights that I think we spontaneously sort of get through this meditation is that no matter how bad things are, they never last forever. And this is very easy to put into words, and it's easy to understand. But the insight that I'm talking about is something that you really get from sitting and observing your emotions. It's essentially like going to the gym for your emotions. Because when guilt shows up, it tends to be very overpowering. I remember when in my guilt-inducing moment of having forgotten a scheduled session, I, I I literally felt like the room was spinning around me for a second. So it's a very disorienting, very intense experience. But what we mean by being with the experience and experiencing it fully is just being able to map what's happening. So, for example, in that moment, for me, it would be something like this. So I'm sitting, I'm feeling that the room is spinning, my heart is racing, my palms are sweating, I'm feeling like my stomach is sinking. Like that would be my description of guilt from that moment. Because when you stabilize yourself for a second and just observe what's happening, the guilt or any intense emotion tends to dissolve. And this is very hard to instruct people to do because it just kind of spontaneously arises from practicing mindfulness. This is why I repeat endlessly, like if you're not going to therapy, just practice mindfulness, because it does teach you that kind of equanimity. I hope that made some sense to you. But this is, people will often say, I can't do this, I'm very sensitive, which I do know that it feels that way. But sensitive just means I don't have this skill. My sister has a very crazy hobby. She runs marathons. I personally find it to be completely masochistic, but she enjoys it. And we had conversations about that so many times is that whenever I see her, I find that it's just completely impressive that she can run a complete marathon. It truly just I don't know, it's incredibly impressive to me. But she insists that this is something everyone can do and that everyone can do it in only a couple of months, which I really don't believe, but I can maybe buy the idea that anyone can do it. From her point of view, it's about preparing yourself properly, about practicing consistently and following some simple rules. And the same goes for our emotions. It's a skill to cultivate. It's not something that people are born with and then they either have it or they don't have it. Even it's the same thing with mindfulness. People will say, well, I can't meditate for more than 5 minutes. Fine. Meditate 5 minutes. Then next week, meditate 7 minutes. And then next week, meditate 10 minutes. And there you go. Now you can meditate 10 minutes. So when you expose yourself to intense emotions in a controlled manner, you will learn how to be with them without being overwhelmed by them. To me, this is a true superpower, but it is uh, something that you can actually cultivate step by step. So this would be the first thing in working with guilt, to actually learn how to observe it. In many ways, this is also a solution to guilt in the sense that when you start observing it, it will dissolve much faster. So it's also a way to, to deal with the feeling itself. But then comes the second part, which is learning from that emotion. We can learn from guilt by sort of analyzing what happened. Uh, I don't suggest that you do this while you feel guilty because it's really a lot of processing for one person. So the first thing you do is you sit, you observe it, you dissolve it, and then you move on to actually reflecting on what happened. The way I like to compare it is like if your house is on fire, you're not going to be looking around thinking, I wonder what caused the fire. You get out, call the firemen, the firefighters, and then you later on think about what caused the fire. And the same goes with this. Like if you're feeling guilty, first, what you have to do is just observe the experience, allow it to pass away instead of clinging to it, because when you cling to it, you're giving it more power. And then once you settle down, you start thinking about what to do with the experience. There are basically two directions for you to think in. One is the obvious one that follows from the definition, which is if we broke one of our commandments, obviously we have to change our behavior. So that would be the most obvious level, I think. If let's say, I did not write down my client's session time, so obviously I have to be much more attentive. So now what I do is that I keep a notepad next to my laptop. So I write it down first there, and then later on, I just copy it in my Google Calendar. So now I have a better mechanism and I know that I'm less likely to make the same mistake. So you use your experience to proactively kind of implement new measures, let's say, to make sure that you adhere to your own rules. The second one is more difficult and in itself often emotionally very exhausting, which is to examine the values that you have. And one example that might be relevant for some of you would be perfectionism, for example. If you remember, we had a whole webinar on perfectionism, and having being perfect as a value once things link into perfectionism, I think without exception, the only possible solution would be not to adapt your behavior, but to change the value. Because perfectionism is entirely unattainable, impossible, and completely disconnected from anyone's lived experience. So no one can be perfect. It just does not happen. So in that sense, the value or your construct is set in such a way that you're very likely, more likely than not, to be dislodged from it. So it's a uselessly defined, badly defined construct. In that sense, either change the way you apply it. So maybe you don't have to give up on your, let's say, ideal self, only understand it in the context of the present moment. See how much you can realistically do in the moment. In the webinar on perfectionism, I gave you several ways in which you can deal with this. Among them was SMART goals, if any one of you remembers that. So there are obviously other ways, but that would be one way to go, which is to adjust the way you operationalize your value. And then sometimes you kind of have to ditch the value altogether. And this is a very difficult, even I'd say a painful process, because you are literally giving up a part of how you see yourself. Sometimes our identity has to change. Uh, this is difficult for several reasons. First of all, it's like amputating an organ because it is a part of who you are. So the process is going to be difficult and it's going to take a long time. And then the second thing is that sometimes we cannot change our values because of our environment. Uh, there are numerous examples for this. One that comes to my mind is that over the years, I've had dozens of clients, for example, who struggled with anxiety and depression because they would come from very, very conservative families or states or countries even. And let's say they were gay, for example, and that causes a huge conflict, which is you cannot give up a part of yourself, but you kind of have to give up all the toxic values that you've internalized. And in some instances, this means that you lose some ties with your community because we are tied to our community with certain sets of shared values. So changing our values is a huge thing. It's very difficult, and it's usually something that we do in therapy, but it is most definitely something that's worth considering. Think about, what value is it? How is it that you use this value in your everyday life? Is it doable, functional, realistic? And then if you cannot change the way you approach that value or the way you cultivate it in your life, then you may consider actually changing the whole value. But by extracting this information from guilt, you're actually making good use out of what is a very painful experience, and you're also preventing future instances of guilt, because that's the whole point. What just happened, but you need to do everything you can so it doesn't repeat itself again. And also, I would caution you not to think of this as being a very simple procedure, even though it might sound that way. Sometimes it's not easy to discover why is it that we feel guilt, because when you look at your behavior and how you feel, you don't see anything wrong. This is because if you remember the pyramid and the constructs, or what I call the boxes, some of our boxes don't have verbal labels on them. So it's kind of like a gut feeling. That's how it operates. Or sometimes it's something you feel in your chest or in your abdomen, like you react with a part of your body instead of a word. So in those moments, well, to be perfectly honest, those kinds of things are best really dealt with in therapy because they are kind of complicated and you need someone to help you put them into words. But what you can do alone is you can journal about them. And then from time to time, just look at these situations. And because once you have more empirical data, then you will be able to, extrapolate a better theory, a better explanation. So you'll be able to put that guilt into words more accurately. So this is everything from my side for this evening. Before we get to the Q&A, let me close the poll and see what we'll talk about next month. Okay, so explaining skin picking to other people, parents, partners, and so on. So that will